So we are going to go through macromolecules. Thank you for joining me in my asynchronous learning kind of virtual classroom. So we're going to kind of go through macromolecules, and this might sound like a new word, but we're really just going to be learning about all the things that you eat and what gives you energy and what are the different properties of things like carbs versus fats versus proteins. And then we'll learn about something called nucleic acids and start breaking down a little bit more in depth what each of those are. And this will be really important because in our next lesson, we're actually going to be learning about all of the different cells that make up our body, and we'll start getting in more in-depth explanations about the way that our body works. So this is a good intro into all of that. So throughout this video, there's going to be times where you might want to pause, answer some questions in your packet, and then return back to the video. That's definitely what I recommend to kind of walk through, get the information, and then you can kind of apply it as you're learning, and that'll really help. If you want to watch the whole video and then do the worksheet, you can do that. If you watch the whole video, do the worksheet while kind of going back through the video. There's lots of different ways you can use this video to your benefit. So let's go ahead and get started here. So macromolecules. These are three of the main structures of macromolecules here. And I'm not going to tell you what is what at the moment, but just look at them and then go ahead and answer these questions. They're also in your packet here. What elements can you identify? We've spent some time with some elements now and different types of atoms, and so which of these ones can you identify? Can you tell me what elements they are? And then just explain. You don't have to know what any of these actually mean in terms of what the arrows mean or what the lines mean, but just let me know simply, how are their shapes different? What do you notice about the shapes? Do you notice that maybe one is organized in like a, what is this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Is that a hexagon? It's in a more particular shape. Meanwhile, these are in chains. There's things that you can just notice without really understanding why it's arranged that way. So just tell me what you notice about the shapes, and then if you can think of a hypothesis, why you think those are structured that way. So go ahead, pause, write your explanations in your packet, and then come back. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and jump into the next slide here. So we're going to start off learning about carbohydrates. And you've probably heard of carbs, carbohydrates before. A lot of people, if they're dieting, tend to think that they have to avoid carbs. There's a lot of different science in terms of diet and what works and what doesn't work. That's not really what this is about. This is more so learning what carbohydrates do for our body and why they're important. So carbohydrates are used to store and release energy. That's kind of their number one thing. We use carbohydrates for those quick bursts of energy as well as to store energy. And then they're also used for structural support and protection. Not necessarily for us, but plants, bugs, and we'll see that in the next slide here. So carbs have three elements. They have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You can see those all listed right here. There's all of our carbons, here's an oxygen, there's a hydrogen, and they're normally found in a 1-to-1 ratio. So, for example, the chemical equation for glucose is C6H12O6. There's 6 carbon, 12, so times 2, hydrogen, and then 6 oxygen. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. There's if you were to divide them all by 6 to find the least common denominator, then it would be 1-to-1, if that makes sense. So they're also sources of instant energy. Like I said, we use carbs for energy, and they have ATP. And ATP is the way that our body is able to get energy in the most simplest form. When you get down to the cellular level, that's what they're going to be using, ATP. And we'll learn about that in our next unit here. Glucose is, like we just saw, one of those really simple carbs, one of those simple sugars. Glucose is actually the body and the brain's main sugar. That's what gives us all of this energy and fuel. And we can use carbs immediately for sugar and for that energy. So if you're sitting there and you knew that you had to go on a run right before gym class, you might want to eat a banana, and then you'll have the energy to run. And then also for your brain, too. That's why it's important to eat a big breakfast before you have a big test, because your brain has to use all of that sugar for energy. And it can be used immediately as glycogen, or it can be stored for later as fat. And we can store it as glycogen too, but most carbs get stored as fat. That's why if you essentially eat too much and your body can't use all of that energy, it'll store it for later, and most of the time it gets stored as fat. Like I said, it could also be stored as glycogen, but most of it gets stored as fat later on, and that involves some chemical processes to get the carbs into a more like fat-like molecule. Carbs are also able to provide support or protection. So here in this picture, you can see these little shapes here. This is actually a plant cell, and these shapes that you see, these boundaries, those are the cell walls. Those are what keeps kind of every cell in its particular place, and it helps plants stay more rigid rather than just flopping over all the time. So plants use it as support. We'll see on the next slide how it can be used for protection. With bugs, for example, they'll use it in their exoskeleton. And then fiber is also a carb. Fiber is found in a lot of fruits and vegetables. Fiber is also, like I had mentioned, a carb, but it takes longer to break down. It has more nutrients per calorie than simple sugars, which is why fiber is healthy for you. But because it does take longer to break down, you don't only want to eat fiber, because then you can get all blocked up, and that's a whole different conversation. But for the most part, it's good to have vegetables in your diet because they do contribute fiber. So there's some particulars that we need to know when it comes to carbohydrates, and those are whether it's a monosaccharide or a polysaccharide. So mono means one, saccharide meaning sugars. So monosaccharide, just one sugars. These are simple. Once again, they're simple. Simple carbs used as energy and structural material. So these are found in DNA and RNA, and we'll learn about those at the end of this presentation here. Polysaccharides are mini sugars. So poly meaning many sugars. And these are covalently bonded, so that means they're sharing electrons. And they are going to do a little bit more. They have more complex functions because they're more complex molecules. So for example, starch as support in plants, and so trees even have their support system as starch, as different kinds of carbohydrates. That's what helps keep them strong. And when you have paper that's made out of trees, there's paper has starch in it. Paper is technically carbohydrate. Glycogen, as I had mentioned before, has those energy bursts. And then what's known as chitin is a carbohydrate, but it's a bug's exoskeleton. So I have in my classroom, if you guys didn't know, I have a few different specimens of insects. I have a scorpion that I found on the back wall, and all of those are their exoskeletons made out of the chitin, made out of the carbohydrates. So not only are carbs sugars for us to eat, but they also can do other functions like support plants and provide exoskeletons to bugs. And then here's just a few pictures of different kinds of arrangements. Here's a monosaccharide. You can see it's just one. It's glucose. Sucrose is a polysaccharide. Here it's a disaccharide. That means two, but it's still many, more than just one. So this is also considered a polysaccharide here. And then here's another polysaccharide. Here it's multiple glucose molecules all bound together to form starch. And so once again, those glucose molecules are bound with a covalent bond, so they're sharing those electrons, and then they're all in one long chain. So that's carbohydrates. And here's some different foods that are pretty common in terms of containing carbs. We normally think of carbs in a negative light. So ice cream, the waffle cones here, sugar, breads, those all have carbs. But so do vegetables and fruits, right? Those also have carbs. Milk has carbs because it has sugar. It's in the form of lactose. If you're lactose intolerant, you're intolerant to the sugar in milk. So a lot of different foods contain carbs, and it's not always bad. Obviously, there's healthy carbs versus not as healthy carbs, but it's also moderation. If you eat lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, then those are all healthy carbs, and then you can have a piece of candy here and there, and it'll be fine. It's when candy and ice cream and sugar are your only form of carb intake that it's probably not as healthy, right? So now we're going to move on to lipids or fats. Lipid is the form of vocabulary that we use when we refer to fats when it's in the body, and more so in biology. So lipids can be used to store energy. So fat is really good at storing energy. Remember, we just learned if you're going to store the energy from carbs for a long time, you'll turn it into a fat. That's because fats are great at storing energy. They are really important at forming biological membranes, so membranes around cells, membranes around organs. They also are able to provide waterproof coverings, and they also help provide insulation from the cold. So let's look at these in more detail here. So fats are a chemical messenger. So chemicals like hormones that have different things that they want to learn, or lessons, different kinds of information that they want to spread throughout the body, that would be traveling on a fat molecule. It's a chemical messenger. They can provide insulation from the cold. So any animal, especially mammals, like to use blubber. Blubber is essentially fat. So walruses, seals, sea lions, whales, any kind of animal that lives in a really cold place like the ocean, especially where it's a little bit harder to keep yourself warm all the time, blubber is really helpful. Blubber is essentially just a really dense fat that keeps you warm. They are able to protect organs, so you have a little bit of fat over all of your organs, and that's to help protect it. If you were to get like kicked or hurt really bad, or something were to happen, that fat is protection. Phospholipids are right down here, and we'll get much more in depth into this, but essentially phospholipids are fats that are kind of surrounding all of the different cells in our body, and they are able to form a membrane that keeps everything out of the cell that we want to stay out of the cell, and everything that we want to stay in the cell in the cell. And the reason that it does that is because the lipids are not necessarily, they don't like water, and so the way that they form basically prevents any water and other stuff from coming through. And once again, we'll get much more in depth in that later on. But you just have to know that lipids, fats, are really important to that membrane surrounding the cell. Fat also helps in the brain. It protects the neurons. And you can see down here, this little cell here, this is a dendrite. And the dendrite has fat on it to help the to help the electric signals flow through our brain. So they really help send messages and nerves and different kinds of information that we need that relies on fat to help get all of those messages through the brain. And once again, they're also really good at storing energy. So fat will have about 2 times the calories per gram when compared to proteins and carbs. So what that means is if you were to eat 2 grams of protein or 2 grams of carbs, you might get, let's say, for example, 100 calories. But if you were to eat 2 grams of fat, you would get 200 calories. And that's really good information if you want to get more energy, like if you're about to go on a really long hike, or if you're about to go work out for a long time. It's probably a good idea to have some more dense energy rather than to have a carbohydrate or a protein that would give you that fast burst, but it won't last very long. So that's why it's a good idea to have a mixture of everything, right? So in terms of lipids in the body, there's 3 main things that we need to know. If it's triglycerides are 3 fatty acid tails, so those have a lot of energy in them. And then there's what's known as saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So saturated fats are a single covalent bond, and they pack really tightly together. They're solid at room temperature, and they're normally considered unhealthy. The reason that they're considered unhealthy is because this pipe here, all of that like white stuff that you see, that's all fat. And this actually happens in our arteries and our veins and in the vessels that blood flows throughout our body. Too much saturated fat can actually clog it up like this. And that's because saturated fat lies flat. And so they can kind of stack on top of each other in a really nice line that doesn't really have any gaps, right? Nothing can get through it. Versus unsaturated fats, they have 1 or more double covalent bonds, and that makes them kind of kink. And so instead of being able to lie flat, they are kind of like this. And so it allows things to move through because they're not just laying nice and stacked on top of each other. They're leaving gaps for for blood to get through, and also they are liquid at room temperature, so they're considered more healthy because if you look at these two examples here, there's butter and then there's oil. Butter is a saturated fat because it's a solid at room temperature, and then oil is liquid at room temperature, so it's more healthy. And if you just kind of think about it in your body, butter might be solid in terms of like blocking the veins and the arteries, while the more liquid, unsaturated fats that are a little bit healthier, they're not going to be solid in your body. They're going to stay liquid, and so they won't really have the same chance of blocking your veins. And so that's the main idea behind saturated fats and unsaturated fats in terms of why is one unhealthy and why the other is healthy. Trans fat is an even worse form of saturated fat, and it's really bad for you primarily because it doesn't occur in nature. Trans fat is something that we've kind of invented, and it's just like saturated fats, except it's worse. It's able to like pack tightly, even more tightly than saturated fats. So once again, saturated fats are solid at room temperature. They stack, and so there's no way that like things can move through them. Like blood won't be able to get past them if they pack too tight. Unsaturated fats, they are kinked, and so they're more healthy. They're liquid at room temperature, and the way that they stack allows blood to continue to move through. So those are fats. And some food containing fats include some healthy fats, like we have nuts, cheeses, soybeans, olives, there's olive oil, peanut butter, nut butters. Fish are really healthy. They have the omega-3s and the omega-6s. And then maybe not as healthy fats are the ones that are more fried. So like pizza, hamburgers, french fries, fried chicken, all of that stuff. It tastes great and it's fine to have in moderation, but because it has more of the saturated fats, it's not as healthy to eat a ton of. And the reasons are just based off of the way that your body uses it, right? Some other forms of fats here, there's the unsaturated fats up here. Don't worry if it's polyunsaturated or monounsaturated. That basically just means poly meaning multiple, remember, and then mono meaning one. But you can see there's some different ones up here, and then there's some more saturated fats and then trans fats down there. And trans fats are, remember, the ones that you actually do want to stay away from. Saturated fats, you don't have to completely eliminate from your diet. You just want to make sure that you're not having too much of it. Okay, so moving on to proteins. Proteins function to control the rate of reactions and regulate cell processes. So essentially there's a ton of reactions going on in your body at one time, and proteins kind of control those. They also form important cell structures. They transport substances in or out of cells, and they help fight diseases. So proteins are really important. And proteins are also a little special. They are normally going to be made out of one or more amino acids. An amino acid is right up here. So it's essentially this molecule. It has hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, and then it has right here this little part that is an R. And that R is the amino, kind of the thing that decides what kind of amino acid it is. And we'll learn more about this as we get more in depth in the cell, but essentially that R can decide which amino acid that this protein molecule is, and there's 21 different types of amino acids. So that R is pretty important. And so these amino acids can link together in a chain or they can stay on their own. We'll see that on the next slide, what happens when they all link together. Proteins are instructed by our DNA. So remember, DNA is the instructions for the cell. They're instructions for our body on what to do. And the DNA essentially tells our body what proteins to make, and then those proteins kind of get everything done. So proteins are built by DNA. They are essential for building new proteins, and they're essential for building DNA and RNA. So DNA instructs how to build proteins, and then proteins then help build DNA. So everything is connected here. So there's 21 amino acids, like I said. Our bodies can only make 12 of them. The other 9 amino acids we have to find in what we eat. So that's where having healthy diet choices is really important, because we got to make sure that our body has all of the building blocks it needs to make the different types of proteins. Proteins move molecules, they send signals, they communicate throughout the body. Here is an example of that plasma membrane. So here's that phospholipid bilayer that we just learned about, that fats are really important for creating. And so in the middle of the phospholipid bilayer, there's these protein channels. And essentially what those do is they say, great, phospholipid bilayer, you're there to prevent anything from getting inside of me. But sometimes there's things that I need to get rid of, or sometimes there's things that I need to bring in. And so these little protein channels here are able to facilitate that. They're able to get rid of stuff that the cell wants to get rid of. They're able to bring in stuff that the cell needs. And so these are really important. Our body actually uses the protein from our muscles if we don't get enough from our diet. So another reason why it's important to eat protein is obviously you don't want your body taking muscle from where you need muscle. Finally, proteins form enzymes. And enzymes are something that is really important to get reactions going in the body, and we'll learn more about those as we learn through the cells. Proteins, like I said, are made out of amino acids, and amino acids have the amino group, the carboxyl group, a hydrogen atom, and then that R group. So we just saw the amino acid. It's right here again. Oops, here, let me get that. So this amino acid, you can see there's the amino group, carboxyl group, there's a hydrogen atom, and then there's the R group. And you don't really need to worry about what all of these things do, except for the R group, because that R group helps decide what amino acid it is. So the R group is really particular and pretty important. So when you have a singular amino acid, now you have to join it together to other things so that we can get a protein that actually is able to perform functions in the body. So for the primary structure, essentially just think of a necklace with a bunch of pearls on it, and all those pearls are different amino acids. And the different order of amino acids that you have, remember there's 21 different kinds, and so having them all in this particular order can change the function of that protein. So let's say you'll have the same amino acid. Let's say we have amino acid 1 3 times, and then there's amino acid 2, and it just becomes a pattern throughout that pearl necklace, and that entire necklace has its own particular function. But if you had, for example, 3 of amino acid number 5 and then 2 of amino acid number 2, it'll have a different function. Does that make sense? So after you have the primary structure, then you'll find that you'll start growing into secondary structure. And secondary structure is where the protein molecule begins to twist and bend and loop and fold, and it becomes much more than just a string of beads. It becomes almost like a sheet of paper that you're able to fold and bend and do all that stuff with. And so as it then continues to grow even more, it finds itself in the tertiary structure. So there's primary structures, the first one, secondary structures, the second one, tertiary structures, the third one. And that essentially makes the protein a working molecule. It's almost like that piece of paper now became a pipe cleaner. It's a little bit more fluffed up, or if you don't know what a pipe cleaner is, I'm trying to think of another example. Even something like a piece of string, or like my little charging cable here, it is rounded, and so it can fold together like this and get all wound up like a knot, and that will give it an actual function, and now it's able to do something in the body, right? Primary and secondary structures was just about getting into the right shape. Tertiary structure, now it's able to do something. And then finally, you have quaternary structure, so the fourth one, and that's where you have 2 or more of the polypeptides together. So you have 2 tertiary structures, and now they're together, and so maybe one protein, one tertiary model does one thing, and then the other protein, the other tertiary model does another. You put them together, and they now have a completely different function that they do in the body. So if this is a little confusing, if this doesn't make too much sense, the main idea here is that amino acids or proteins have 4 different structures: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, and each structure becomes more complex. Primary is the most simple, quaternary is the most complex, and quaternary is where you're actually able to get a protein that it's two different proteins that work together. And then tertiary structure is the protein it's actually a working molecule. So primary and secondary are just getting ready to do something. Tertiary and quaternary is actually doing something. So some examples of protein include keratin, and keratin is what's found in our nails, in our hair, in even like horse hooves, rhino horns. That's all keratin. It's the same exact thing. It's a protein that helps make hair and nails and hooves and all of that. There's actin and myosin, and those are found in the body. Let me see if I included a picture. Well, I didn't. Actin and myosin are in your muscles, and they essentially are what determine whether or not the muscle is tight and clenched or if it's relaxed. So there's so many different proteins. They do so many different things. So I've got a little video here just for you guys to see what proteins do in the body. In this little video clip, they're going to be making DNA. So we don't have to watch the whole thing. I just wanted to give you guys a good idea of what proteins look like. All right, so what we're seeing here, I'm going to go ahead and just narrate because we're not going to watch the whole video and I don't want to get lost in all of the details of what's happening. I just want you guys to see an example of what proteins do in our body. So what they're doing right now, all of the different blue and green and purple different shapes that you see, those are all proteins. And so it's giving you the names like helicase, and the red thing that they're working on right now, that's DNA. And this is what it actually looks like in our body. They're unwinding the DNA and then they're using it to basically write a new recipe, a new set of instructions that will then code for more proteins. And so all of these proteins here are working together to essentially make a copy and get the message from the DNA. And so here you can see another protein. It's that purple one. It's a histone, and that's what helps keep DNA in place. And it's going to go through a few different ones. We don't need to get too involved there, but essentially they all work to keep everything organized in the cell. So let's find another example here. So as it's building, these different proteins that you can see that are in the green area, those proteins are kind of building these molecules here, these long chains, and then they're actually walking on these chains here. That's what they actually do. This is what they look like in the body. This is some really, really impressive computer modeling, essentially, that's based off of the research that's been done. And so we know that essentially we have little machines working in our bodies. They're made out of proteins, and those proteins are instructed by DNA, and that's the last little macromolecule that we're going to learn about. So before we do that, I just wanted to go through these other two examples. These are foods that commonly have protein in them. So beans, nuts, legumes, a lot of things that have fats also have protein. So protein is important. Protein is kind of what allows our body to do the things that it needs to do. Protein doesn't just make you strong. Protein builds DNA and helps our muscles contract and so many other things in the body. So that's protein. Okay, and then let's move on to the last one, nucleic acids. Now, nucleic acids store and transmit hereditary or genetic information. Essentially, DNA, RNA, the coding, the instructions for our cells are stored in nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are made of what's known as a nucleotide. A nucleotide is made of three components. It's a carbon sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. And that's what it looks like here. There's two different types. There's deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. Essentially, there's DNA and there's RNA. And each of them are made of nucleotides. And nucleotides have different names depending on which one they are. And so there's 4 different ones for RNA and DNA, but RNA and DNA have 3 of the same nucleotides and then 1 different one. So RNA has cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil. So it has a C, a G, and A, and a U. DNA has the same cytosine, guanine, and adenine, but instead of uracil, it has thymine. So DNA letters are C, G, A, and T. And we'll get more into this as we go through the cell more in depth. But essentially, you just need to know DNA is C, G, A, and T, and DNA has 2 strands. RNA is C, G, A, U, and it has 1 strand. Once again, we'll get much more in depth in this later on, but for now, you just need to know RNA has 1 strand and it has a U. DNA is 2 strands and has a T. And those are the 2 different types of nucleic acids that just contain information, and they send it to proteins, and it helps use it to build proteins and all the different things that we need in our body. So these are, like I had mentioned, these are the instructions, these are the recipes for you. It's found in those nucleic acids. Okay, and nucleic acids are formed of multiple nucleotides that are bonded by covalent bonds, once again, sharing those electrons there. Now that we've covered macromolecules, we've learned about carbs, carbohydrates. They give us energy. We've learned about lipids or fats. They also help store energy, but they have the ability to store a lot of energy, and they can also do other functions like insulation, keeping us warm. We learned about proteins that are made out of 21 different types of amino acids, and each amino acid has its own special R group or R identifier, and those essentially help build and do a lot of the things in our body that needs to get done. And then finally we learned about nucleic acids, which are the parts of our body that write the instructions, and they're kind of like the recipe for us. So this is all the information that you guys need to know about macromolecules. So hopefully this video serves helpful. You guys can kind of go back through it as you're doing the worksheet and pause it at any moments. Rewatch different parts if you need to kind of hear that explanation again. But otherwise, you guys have watched the video, and now all that's left is to complete your worksheet. Thanks, guys.